could be a little tough to do this all day. So can I move this, Rob? Is that going to cause you guys grief? All right. You'll be paying attention to that a lot more than me. So John and I have been research partners for 6 years. And John specialized more in the trial room, loved it. I was more in the grounds outside here, and the execution that obviously took place on the tennis courts of all places. So what I'm going to show you tonight, what I do is I look at photos. I've always been interested in the photos that I've been able to find, and John's found quite a few of them during our research of Fort McNair. I think we probably have in excess of about 50 original photos from the time period. I then take it and look at the details within those photos. That's just something I find. I'm very detail oriented, so I create another 2,000 images from 50 filed. Tonight I've got 300 to show you in 25 minutes, so it's going to be a little rapid fire. I'm going to, some of that's on timer so I don't slow down and stop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by taking you through just a couple of the things that my research and digging into the details has helped to pull out, and John and I have discovered over the last few years. And then we're going to take a tour of the Arsenal grounds 1865, 1860s to 1865. And then I will take you into the cell blocks to show you pretty well where the prisoners were. The prisoners were moved around a number of times during their stay during the trial. On the July 6, July 7 period, which was the last move before the execution, we have the final locations of the cells, and I'm going to show that to you visually. And then we're going to go through a 9-minute presentation. It'll luckily be automatic on the Alexander Gardner photos, the 10 Alexander Gardner photos that we know of. I think there are more, but we have 10 that are well known. I'm going to take you through those and a lot of the details that came from some of those. So and then time permitting, because we're going to be going out to the grounds, John and I, as you can tell by his sunburn, spent the afternoon laying out everything from the scaffold to the graves, John Wilkes Booth's burial place, the entry door or the exit door that the prisoners took to come out into the yard, and the shoe factory where Gardner was set up with his 2 cameras, his stereoscope and his full format camera. So you'll get a good feel for the actual location when we go out there. Like I say, time permitting, it's the last part of this presentation. I'll show you how I came up at least with the scaffold position. So and I'm going to try to do this. All right. First of all, 3 years ago, John in our research went up into the model arsenal where the last photo was taken of the execution. He couldn't get up all the way. He got up as far as the attic. You'll see when we look at the model arsenal a little bit later, there used to be a fenced area right on top, which was about, the camera position would probably have been about 10 to 15 feet higher than John's position. But if you look where the overlap goes, I wanted to show you where the actual prison and where Grant Hall currently stands today. So that is the building, as Mike said. There was a debate back when. Well, it's hard to, I was going to go a couple of times. And I put a line just so you can see where the edge of the building is. Right here is the door where the prisoners were marched out. And we'll come back to that. So I just want to give you a feel of what you're going to be seeing when we go over there in comparison to the 300-foot penitentiary that went forward. Again, my biggest thing is taking images that are high-res and zooming in on it. It's because when I first got into this as a kid, I was interested in the subject matter, but when you'd look at books over the years, you get fuzzy pictures like this, and you say, hey, that's great, look at this, I can see what happened. Well, about 6, 7 years ago, the Library of Congress published about 3,000 Civil War images online in high-res definition. So that allowed me, and it was right around the time I started my research, we went from doing something that looked like this to something as clear as that, which then allowed me to move in and look at details that you could get pretty close. And you could see things like, you know, a piece of string that came off Mary's bindings as she spun. Another thing, you take first-person eyewitness accounts, which is something I take and combine them because I think you need, obviously, both. Just looking at a picture isn't always the way to go. One of the reports, when they were testing the traps early in the morning before the executions, this trap in particular, that's the door that's down, they were having trouble having it work. So when there was a prop that sat below this, and when they would knock it out, that's how the trap would fall. They were having trouble, it was sticking. So I knew the story from the papers that this is what the issue was, but I never saw a picture of it until that. That's the damage they had to do to the beam and the upright and the cross brace just to get that trap to fall, and they used hatchets and saws. So it's that type of detail that I really enjoy getting into. So I'm just going to show you a couple of things quickly. It partly relates to what we're talking about tonight, but it'll give you an example of what detail can help when you're looking at history. I don't know how many of you know this image. This is General Hartranft and his staff. This is Christian Rath, who was assigned as the executioner that day. This is the general here. It was funny, John and Betty Owensby and I, about 2 years ago, we were trying to determine what was the date of this photo. There's no date on it. It was assumed it was the day of the execution. To this day, we still don't know 100%, but during that conversation, I decided I'm going to look around with my, a fine-tooth comb and see what I could find. The wall behind there, the one thing we needed to find out was where was this picture taken? There's 300 feet times 4 sides of brick wall on the inside of this prison, so where was it taken? Well, luckily enough, I happened to spot some spots on the out-of-focus wall behind these folks. I thought, well, I'll mark a few and I'll see with the pictures that we have, maybe I can match them. It was a long shot. You can see some around Christian Rath's head. There's a specific pattern that made it possibly something I could hang my hat on. So this happened to be the first image I looked at. It had a long expanse of wall, and you just wouldn't believe what I found. I found the same dot pattern. And by doing that and comparing the two together, I'll give you a second to just, what that did was told me that off to the left of the scaffold, that was roughly the camera position, and set back behind where the scaffold was, that's where that photo was taken. Now haven't taken that any further, it might still help us to find out whether that was July 7th or another date. Haven't gotten that far yet. Sometimes I deal with shadows. You deal with the elements, whatever you can when you're looking through pictures. I took the 5 photos that were taken with Gardner's full format camera because they all lined up. They were taken from the same angle. And I'll just show you, they kind of line up there with the 2 lines. But if you look at the shadows on the left, that's a timeline. And that, I can tell you, that's roughly a 45-minute timeline from the time that first shadow, which was his initial starting shot of the empty scaffold, which was a test shot, to about, this is after the hanging, probably about 45 minutes later. There's obviously other photos that were taken, but those are stereoscopes taken from a different window, so the angles are different. So that's just some of the things that I've done over the last 4 or 5 years just to help me to better understand what happened that day. So we're going to take that tour of roughly 1865, and I'm going to start off with an illustrator, because I think illustrations are very helpful as well in our research. This is Alfred Waud. He was an illustrator, Civil War illustrator, and I think it was 1862. He drew this photo from across the Potomac of the arsenal and the insane asylum. It's hard to see it there. I'm going to zoom in on it. So you can see the arsenal penitentiary starting to come in. And what I love about the NDU, Susan Lemke and her team. I don't know where Susan is, but they were really good to us when we first started our research. And you have 2 photos in your collection, and this is one here. It's not quite the same angle, but it's the first time that we had a chance to see the front of the building. And some of you may have never seen some of these photos. That's why I wanted to bring as many of these out as I can. You can see it's low tide with the Potomac. And I'm going to start on this side quickly because I want to show you that's where the trial was held. There are 2 windows up there that were exposed. There's just quickly, that's the same green is just showing you that area. The arrow is pointing to the prisoner's dock and the window that John talked about, Sam Arnold looking out and gazing out hours and hours on end. I was glad you brought that up, John. It's a great segue. And there's Sam in that window, and that's a window you'll be able to see when you go over there. It still exists. So moving over to the other side, I wanted to show you something from the middle, the main gate. This is an architectural drawing from 1830 when the architects were drawing it. They did a really good job building it. That was almost dead on. So it's again just more of interest, something to see. I find that type of thing fascinating. Go to the east end, east end of the building, and then out there were 2 piers, one here and one at Greenleaf Point, which is at the far end. There's another thing in Wad's sketch down here, and this will mean more to the military folk here, and later I'm going to ask you what is a pendulum. But there were 2 pieces there called pendulums, and they were for testing artillery and guns. I don't know if the purpose of it was to deaden the sound or to hide it from the enemy when they were testing new guns. I'm sure I'm going to be educated after this, but I wasn't here to talk about pendulums, so forgive me for not knowing the detail of that. What I did want to show you for my research and John's was at the very back is the first time we had a chance to see the southeast corner of the penitentiary. We still don't have a clear view of that, but we're hopeful that one day we'll come across it, but this was as close as we got. Just in front of it, though, there was a building which was a guardhouse, and what we believe might have been, when John Wilkes Booth's body was brought, after his autopsy, he was brought to the Greenleaf Point and walked up, and they put him in what was called soldier's cottage. We believe this is the building. And he was put there just for a short time before he was brought inside and buried under one of the floors of the penitentiary. I found this photo. It's the same building, just from a different angle. Now you're actually up against the penitentiary wall at that end. And there's some interesting things that you can see here. The building itself, there's a large arch. Now, if any of you are familiar with this sketch, which was a Colonel Benton sketched this on the day the prisoners were brought into the Arsenal Penitentiary. We believe this is the same arch. Sorry. And behind it, there's the steamship. And the reason I show you that is that you can see it in the background there, is if we go back outside, and you remember that pier that we were just looking at. If you look at the back here, this is not the same steamship, I'm sure, but I just a paddle wheeler, but there is one right there. So it's very likely that drawing is in fact showing the angle that you would have seen through there. Model Arsenal, it's still one of my favorite buildings actually, because so much was done from there as far as the photography of the location. The Model Arsenal and the east end of the penitentiary where the executions took place. I'm going to zoom in on this. That was the perch where the photography took place. John's photo, just to bring into context, or give you a little context, if the photo was actually taken from this side out that way, but just pretend it was here. That's as high up as he could get for the photo he took. So it's about a 12, 15 foot difference. Some of the photos that were taken from that perch, this is looking south into the Arsenal yard. Winter time, obviously. You can see the pendulums off to the right here. And probably summertime, where the trees this was taken by a photographer named A.J. Russell. And I'm going to finish the tour with these two photos that we have. One is at the Library of Congress. This is not the execution photo. This is we're not sure who took this photo. And we were always frustrated in our research where we could never see the Capitol building. What was on this side here? Again, the NDU, and Susan, in her generosity, had a photo. Sorry, I'm gonna jump, show you quickly where. Let me just show you quickly. I'm sorry, I didn't know I put it in this way. Where Gardner took his photos from. That's the shoe factory where he had two cameras set up, one a full format and one a stereoscope. That was his perch for the execution. That was the location of the scaffold. And as I said before, that's the door that the prisoners were taken from. Here's the photo I was meaning to show you. There's the Capitol building. Here's obviously the penitentiary. And like any good researcher who wants to see a panoramic view, we glued them together. Had no idea if they were taken same day, but when we did that, this was the overlap of the two photos. I got curious and wanted to know two things. When were these photos taken? So were they taken the same day or were they not? And what is the date of the photos? That little strip seemed to be the only way to find out the first question. Were these photos taken the same day? Because this is the only common ground that I had to work with. Library of Congress, National Defense University, they look very similar. There's some very similarities, and then you have some non-similarities. You have a train being unloaded here, you have a white horse, but over here you have a brown horse. Could have been the same day, could have been a different day. It's like doing the shadows. I decided to look for patterns, and the only common place I could find a pattern, you had a common tree here. I looked for leaf patterns. Because it was taken the same day, it's very likely that the leaves would not have changed too much. I'm going to show you 4 different spots. So that told me the LOC photo was taken by the same photographer on the same day. They were actually taken about 40 minutes apart. Through some shadow analysis I did, I have no idea why. He could have taken other shots from around, and he also moved his camera just slightly to the left for the second shot, but these were taken same day. So how do we figure out perhaps a date? These were both undated at the time we were looking at this. The clue came from the Capitol building. Looked through this, could not find any clues that really gave us a date. One thing I wanted to point out is that this fence surrounded the entire arsenal. This is the magazine that was out away from everybody else. But as I zoomed in on there, you'll notice there's some scaffolding at the very top where the Statue of Freedom was being installed. Statue of Freedom was dedicated December 2nd, 1863. So if they're working on that, I went back and I found photos of the Capitol building being used. There was nothing on the top in July of 1863. So this had to happen after 1863 and before December 2nd. So we're thinking late fall perhaps. Here's a photo different from the Capitol. You can see the same scaffolding up here. Again, there's snow on the ground. So I was happy to report, and I sent Susan my report about 2 years ago when I did this. I pick them in at about late fall 1863. Again, I thank the NDU and the library staff for getting us that photo, because that opened up a lot of great information for our research. All right. Now I'm going to take you to July 6th. The prisoners who were to be executed found out their fate on July 6th, roughly around noon. Short time after that, basically at noon when they found out, they had less than 24 hours to live. The execution would take place sometime between 10 and 2 o'clock the following day. Prisoners were moved one last time. There was, like I said, over their 7 weeks, they were moved several times. This is the north side, so this is looking out towards the Capitol. The south side faces the south yard where the execution took place. This is an illustration from Frank Leslie, I think, rather than, I don't like to call them the usual suspects, but we've seen these photos so often. But there were of the 8 prisoners who were here on that date, there was one additional prisoner you may not know about. That was Burton Harrison, who was Jefferson Davis's secretary. He had been captured and was also being held with the rest of the prisoners. So on July 7, on the morning of the execution, we're just going to go through this quickly. These were the final locations. This is the south, so you're facing towards they moved 4 prisoners to the first floor so that it would be easy on a number of reasons. Security, it allowed for families and ministers to come in freely, lawyers, family. And they basically kept them away from everyone else who was on the south side who hadn't been told their fates at that point. These are just some of the illustrations at the time. We'll swing it around. I thank John for the structure. He did the SketchUp model on this one. Ed Spangler is on the first floor. Dr. Mudd was on the second tier. Sam Arnold was on the third tier, and just above him was Burton Harrison. And finally, Michael O'Loughlin was on the top corner. Those are the final positions on the July 7th. Going back to the north side, I felt like doing this yesterday. I can't help myself. I thought just to give you a little more here's the north side position. I do it more for me than anyone else, but I'm glad I can share it with you. This is roughly a 9-minute presentation. I'm going to talk very little throughout this. I'm going to rest my voice, but I'm going to let the pictures kind of talk for itself, except for a couple of times that I think I'll try to clarify what you're seeing. The newspapers were full of it was the news, it was the big story. I think what we're going to get here is a repeat, because I think I doubled up on these. Yeah. So I'm going to zip through this one more time. If you've seen this before, just raise your hand or ignore it.
Is this going to be on the test?
This will be on the test. You got it twice. You know it's going to be there. Okay. The times are approximate, but they're not far off. I believe the first test photo that was taken from the window was the empty scaffold. And on it, you can tell the soldiers have not come to attention yet. They're still at ease. 2 soldiers had brought the 4 chairs out and set them up for the prisoners. This scaffold measures 10 feet deep by 20 feet wide. It was a hot day, 95 plus at noon. You had officials and obviously artists and newsmen who were there. This is the execution party, 4 soldiers who volunteered without knowing what they were getting into. At about 1:06, the execution party left the building, and I tested it today. It's about 25 steps from the door to the base of the stairs. About 2 minutes later, they've assembled on top of the scaffold and are settling in. Mary Surratt has been seated. Lewis Powell's been seated. George Atzerott's been seated. David Harold had also been seated, but in this picture, they're actually picking him back up so they can move his chair to face forward. And you'll see in the next sequence, both Atzerott's chair and Harold's chair faces forward. The news folks were always close at hand. The 4 men responsible for triggering. This is William Cauchon. He was a veteran of the St. Petersburg Battle of St. Petersburg, and he lost his left index finger. Well, I was looking through the empty scaffold picture one day, and I found him. Here's the man missing his left index finger. Cauchon eventually, because of the heat and obviously what he was going through, got ill and vomited later during that sequence. Once they settled in, General Hartranft had the death warrant, and he read the sentence, the charges, and then the sentences. David Harold's minister, Reverend Olds, is leaning into him. Mary Surratt with her 2 priests. She was kissing the cross there, which is well documented. At about 1:17, and I will always thank Betty Omsby for this image because we couldn't find it anywhere. This is the ministers pray. After the death warrant had been read, the ministers, the Catholic priests for Mary Surratt did not speak. Reverend Gillette for Lewis Powell is kneeling there. He prayed first, said a prayer, followed by Reverend Olds and then Reverend Butler for the other 2 gentlemen. This is the only photo you actually have of Lewis Powell that you can see when he's not behind that center upright. After that, there wasn't much left to do. They stood the prisoners up, moved them forward onto the 4-foot deep traps. Through the use of Colonel Lafayette Baker's detectives, they helped to noose the 3 men. The man in white, just so you know, this is something we discovered, is not the executioner, Christian Rath. That's Christian Rath just behind it. It's something John and I discovered about 3-4 years ago. That gentleman with Lewis Powell is John Roberts, one of his Baker's detectives. Mary Surratt was attended by 2 of Hartranft's senior military men. 1:25, the silent clap, and I believe the clap was 1, 2, 3, according to most of the descriptions. The 2 men, there were only 2 men that actually, one that was on each side, actually pushed the striking beam to strike the props, and the prisoners fell. Mary Surratt and George Atzerodt pretty well lost unconscious instantly. Regrettably, Lewis Powell and David Harold did not, and they ended up strangling until they lost consciousness, which paper said anywhere from 2 to 7 minutes. I doubt if it was 7, but a few minutes later, this is the aftermath. There's actually a media scrum happening just off to the left of the scaffold. people in white. Everyone under an umbrella is part of the staff. This is John Collins, a 15-year-old boy. He wasn't a drummer boy. His older brother was actually in the unit that he was there as a mascot. There's General Hartranft. 136, a second photo was taken similar, but this one is with the stereoscope camera. This had quite a lot of clarity for the stereoscopes that we have. In this one, you can actually see things like the chains hanging from Powell's ankles, his lily irons. All 4 prisoners had lily irons holding their wrists. Roughly about 136 now, just off to the right, is a photo taken of 3 of the graves. According to papers, they were buried in the order they were hanged. Some of the tools used for that. There's actually 4 coffins there, not 3, which I get that question a lot. It's just the way they're stacked. And finally, the rooftop view, which we were looking at earlier. I like this picture. It shows a tremendous amount of detail and gives you sort of an atmosphere. And one thing you'll see is they've moved the 4 coffins underneath the scaffold. That's so the doctors could climb up rather than using ladders. They could climb up and check the prisoners. But if you look out over the rooftop, I started to see some things in the background which are kind of interesting. The unfinished Washington Monument. If you go over to the other side, which we'll look at in a second here, you probably recognize that. It's Smithsonian. There's no photos of the aftermath, but there were 3 illustrations. After this, the prisoners were taken down one at a time, again examined by the doctors to ensure they were dead, and buried. From start to finish, from the time they walked out to the time they were buried, it was probably about an hour and 15 minutes, start to finish. Now, I was going to show you this last thing, and but I think we're out of time here for me, so I'll show you when we're over there.